The story of the plagues of Egypt, as recounted in the biblical book of Exodus, is one of the most well-known and dramatic narratives in the Judeo-Christian tradition. This epic tale describes a series of devastating calamities that befell the land of Egypt, culminating in the Israelites' dramatic exodus from slavery under the Pharaoh's rule. For centuries, scholars, theologians, and laypeople alike have debated the nature of these plagues. Were they truly supernatural, divinely orchestrated events, or could they be explained as natural phenomena that occurred in that region at that time? This is a question that has fascinated people for millennia, and one that we will explore in depth in this video. We'll begin by providing an overview of the 10 plagues as they are described in the biblical account. The first plague turned the Nile River to blood, making the water undrinkable. This was followed by an infestation of frogs, then lice, then swarms of flies. The livestock of Egypt were then struck by a disease that killed them, followed by boils afflicting the Egyptian people. Hail, locusts, and darkness then plagued the land, before the final and most devastating plague, the death of the firstborn sons of Egypt. These plagues are presented in the Bible as divinely orchestrated events, punishments inflicted upon the Egyptian Pharaoh and his people for their refusal to let the Israelite slaves go free. The text makes it clear that Moses, acting on God's behalf, called forth each of these calamities. But is this the only possible explanation? Some scholars have proposed that many of these plagues can be linked to natural phenomena that were common in that region and time period. For example, the turning of the Nile to blood could have been caused by a massive algal bloom, which can give the water a reddish hue. Frogs, flies, and lice infestations are also not uncommon occurrences in that environment. Disease outbreaks among livestock are sadly all too familiar, as are hailstorms, locust swarms, and sudden periods of darkness. So the question arises, were these events truly supernatural, divine interventions, or simply natural disasters that the ancient Israelites interpreted through the lens of their faith? This is a complex issue that scholars have debated for centuries, and there is no clear consensus. But let's examine some of the key arguments on both sides. Those who favor a supernatural, divine explanation point to the timing and severity of the plagues as evidence that they were orchestrated by a higher power. The fact that each plague was called forth by Moses, and that they struck Egypt in a specific order, suggests a level of intentionality and control that goes beyond natural causes. Additionally, the Bible describes the plagues as being so devastating that they fundamentally disrupted Egyptian society and finally compelled the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Proponents of this view argue that the scale and coordination of the plagues, as well as their targeted impact on the Egyptians while sparing the Israelites, point to a divine hand at work. They suggest that natural phenomena alone could not account for the precision and severity of these events. The biblical text portrays the plagues as miraculous, supernatural occurrences that demonstrate God's power and justice. On the other hand, those who favor a more naturalistic explanation argue that many of the plagues can be linked to known environmental factors in that region. For example, the Nile River turning to blood could have been caused by a massive algal bloom, as mentioned earlier. These blooms are not uncommon in the Nile, and can produce a reddish, blood-like appearance. Similarly, the plague of frogs may have been triggered by heavy rains or flooding, which can drive large numbers of frogs into populated areas. Proponents of this view argue that the ancient Israelites, with their limited scientific understanding, simply interpreted these natural events through the lens of their religious beliefs. They suggest that the biblical authors framed the plagues as divinely orchestrated to serve the narrative and theological purposes of the Exodus story, rather than as a literal, historical account. Additionally, some scholars point to evidence of similar natural disasters and phenomena occurring in that region around the same time period, independent of the Exodus narrative. For example, ancient Egyptian records describe periods of ecological distress, livestock disease, and strange weather patterns that could potentially align with the biblical plagues. So in essence, the debate boils down to whether one views the plagues as supernatural, divinely orchestrated events, or as natural phenomena that were interpreted and presented in a theological framework. Both perspectives have merit, and both have been advocated by respected scholars and theologians over the centuries. Ultimately, I don't think there is a clear, definitive answer. The biblical text presents the plagues as divine interventions, but it's possible that the ancient Israelites were simply trying to make sense of devastating natural disasters through the lens of their faith. The truth may lie somewhere in the middle, perhaps a combination of natural and supernatural factors that culminated in the dramatic events described in Exodus. One interesting perspective comes from the field of biblical archaeology. Some archaeologists have suggested that the Exodus narrative may have been influenced by real-world events and environmental conditions in that region during the Late Bronze Age, when the Israelites are believed to have departed Egypt. For example, recent research has pointed to evidence of climate change, drought, and societal upheaval in the ancient Near East around that time period. Could it be that the Israelites experienced a series of natural disasters and crises, and then interpreted those events through the framework of their developing theological understanding of God's power and justice? This would not negate the divine element, but would suggest that the plagues were not necessarily supernatural, miraculous occurrences, but rather natural phenomena that were perceived and presented as such. Another factor to consider is the broader cultural and historical context of the Exodus narrative. The ancient Near East was a region rich in mythological and legendary traditions, many of which involved the intervention of deities in human affairs. The idea of a powerful deity inflicting plagues and disasters upon a stubborn ruler was a common trope in ancient Near Eastern literature. It's possible that the authors of the Exodus story drew upon these existing mythological motifs and adapted them to fit their own theological and historical purposes. In this view, the plagues may have been a literary device used to highlight God's supremacy over the Egyptian pantheon, as well as to dramatize the Israelites' journey to freedom. Ultimately, I don't think there is a single, definitive answer to the question of whether the plagues were divine or natural in origin. The biblical text presents them as divinely orchestrated events, but the possibility of natural explanations cannot be dismissed. It's likely that the truth involves a complex interplay of both natural and supernatural factors, filtered through the religious worldview of the ancient Israelites. What we can say with certainty is that the plagues of Egypt, whether divine or natural, had a profound and lasting impact on the Judeo-Christian tradition. This dramatic narrative has captivated the imaginations of believers and non-believers alike for millennia, and continues to be a subject of intense scholarly and theological debate. As we grapple with this question, it's important to remember that the biblical text was not intended to be a scientific or historical account, but rather a theological and narratival exploration of God's relationship with humanity. The Exodus story, including the plagues, is fundamentally about the power of faith, the struggle for freedom, and the triumph of the divine over the forces of oppression. Regardless of one's perspective on the origins of the plagues, there is no denying the enduring significance of this story. It has shaped the worldview and values of countless individuals and communities over the centuries, and continues to be a rich source of inspiration, reflection, and debate. In the end, perhaps the true lesson of the plagues of Egypt is not whether they were divine or natural, but rather the timeless themes of justice, redemption, and the transformative power of faith that they embody. As we explore this captivating narrative, let us do so with a spirit of open-mindedness, intellectual curiosity, and a deep appreciation for the enduring wisdom of the human experience.